Now, as you get to today's passage, we see a very famous account told in a lot of children's stories and found in children's books and that kind of a thing. And here's where I want to start. I want to start with the very last verse that was read for you, verse 10, where Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Now, in these few words, we get from Jesus the explanation for what just took place, but even more so than that, we get a glimpse into Jesus' mission. This was his mission statement. This is the reason why he came into the world, to seek and to save the lost. And what we learn from the example of Zacchaeus is how to respond to that seeking. And so here's what I want to do. As we look at today's passage, I want to see it through 3 points, each giving us a glimpse of how we are to respond to the seeking of God in such a way as to lead to an experiential and transformative encounter with Jesus Christ. How are you going to meet Jesus in a way that is going to change your life? It's by responding to his seeking in 3 different ways. First, you do this by getting close, to get close. And second, you need to work through the scandal. And lastly, you need to invite him in. You need to get close, work through the scandal, and you need to invite him in. So first, you need to get close. Now, we see in the beginning of the passage, we see that Jesus was passing through the city called Jericho. Now, we are at Luke chapter 19, which is coming towards the tail end of what scholars call the travel narrative in the book of Luke that began in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, where Jesus first says that he set his face towards Jerusalem. Right? So from Galilee, he sets off towards Jerusalem, and as he is traveling through these different cities, we see that he performed a bunch of miracles, he did a lot of teaching, and so understandably, Jesus attracted a huge crowd so that by the time he gets to the city called Jericho, he was one of the most sought-out figures in the entire region. Everywhere he went, he couldn't go without a crowd following him. And so he comes to the city called Jericho, which was one of the major cities in the entire area, and here's where we meet this man named Zacchaeus. Now, we are not told why this was the case, but it is apparent to us through the passage that Zacchaeus was seeking to see who Jesus was. And we also know that he was short in stature and he could not see over the crowd. And so what does Zacchaeus decide to do? He climbs up a tree. Now, I don't think I need to say more about this, but it was undignified for a grown man, especially in this day, to climb a tree. He would have had to, they all wore kind of long robes. He would have had to gird up his robes and climb a tree like a little kid. So it was a very undignified thing for a grown man like Zacchaeus to do. Now, at this point, we are not told what it was about Jesus that compelled Zacchaeus to such a degree for him to climb a tree. But the focus of the text is what Zacchaeus did when he found Jesus to be compelling. He got close. Now, obviously, he had many reasons to not do what he did. He had many reasons to walk away. It would have been the crowd or the indignity, right, of having to climb a tree. And the fear, as we will see, of being ridiculed by a crowd that for sure disdained him. He had every reason to walk away from this, or at the very least stay where he was. And yet, even in spite of all of those reasons, he decides to climb the tree. Why? Just going by the text, we know it's because it was not enough for Zacchaeus to encounter Jesus through his reputation from a distance, but for Zacchaeus, he needed to see him with his own 2 eyes, up close and personal. There was no promise of a personal interaction. There was no promise of a private access to Jesus. But he said, if I can just get a couple of feet closer to this man, that's enough for me. I'll do what it takes. Now, let me just put this in perspective for us, because Zacchaeus' instinct to do this is actually more countercultural than it sounds today. Because we live in a culture where we've kind of been trained through technology and our devices and our social interactions to become passive consumers of relationship, of information, of content. Here's what I mean. Every single content that is imaginable, that exists here in this world, is delivered to us in short form. TikTok, Reels, YouTube Shorts, whatever the case may be, and it is delivered right to your phone. Right? That's how we interact with the world. That's how we've been trained to interact with the world. And so for many of us, we are just knowledgeable enough to have an opinion about everything, all the while deeply invested into hardly anything. We don't need to investigate anything for ourselves, because the algorithm will take care of it for us. And so all we have to do is just sit back and scroll along and receive. Here's a danger in our culture, is that Jesus, for so many of us, gets processed exactly the same way. He gets flattened with the rest of your content, and depending on what your algorithm feeds your phone, a version of Jesus' reputation gets delivered right to your phone, and that's the extent of our relationship with Jesus. There is no need to investigate Jesus. There's no need to get close when he is delivered right to your phone. That takes zero work. And no wonder why, for most of us, we keep a safe distance from Jesus. Right? We have opinions about Jesus. We have opinions about what society or life or culture would look like if Jesus had to say, because we've had it delivered to us from so-called experts, influencers. And even for those of us who claim to be Christians, we love performing faith from a safe distance. But here's the thing, we hear over and over again from Scripture, you simply cannot know Jesus from a distance. You have to get close. And so if you're curious at all today about who Jesus is, you're not going to receive him through your phone, through whatever algorithm feeds you. You're not going to receive him simply by having his presence mediated to you. I love our Sunday worship. Don't get me wrong, and I put a lot of time and effort into crafting these sermons. But that's not going to be enough for you to actually have a personal encounter with Jesus. Simply not going to happen. And so, friends, if you're exploring Christianity today, if you're curious at all about this person of Jesus, let me just present this to you. Jesus Christ, I would dare argue, and I don't think I would meet too much opposition here in this room. Jesus Christ, I think it's safe to say, is the single most consequential figure in world history. He single-handedly changed the course of world history and changed billions of people's lives through his person and teaching. Here's a question. What if this Jesus Christ of the Scriptures was God who actually walked into the city of Jericho that day? What if this is a God who actually speaks today through the Bible? What if he actually does have the power to change your life? Again, it's not of my interest to, if you've come to church for the very first time today, or if you've grown up in the church and you don't really consider yourself to be a Christian, isn't this a figure that's worth wrestling with? Isn't this a person that is worth your investigation, your effort, whatever it costs for you to climb a tree, to see him for yourself? And even if you are a Christian, I would pose the same question to you. What if Jesus Christ is more than just a religious totem for you to base your culture or your social group around? What if he actually does speak today? What if he is a God who is not dead but alive? That has the authority to speak into your life, to call you out for your sin, to call you into holiness? What if he has something to say about your job? What if he has something to say about your marriage and a relationship with your children? What if he has something to say about the trauma that you carry with you? Friends, whether you're exploring Christianity for the first time or you've considered yourself to be a Christian all your life, you cannot know Jesus from a distance. You need to get close. And for Zacchaeus, he said, no matter the cost, whether it be intellectual or social, personal, it was worth it. Just to see who he is. Friends, that's why we are gathered here Sunday after Sunday. Get close. See him for yourself. That's the first thing that you have to do. But secondly, you also have to work through the scandal. Now here I want to give you a picture of who Zacchaeus was as a man. And we get three descriptors. We talked about the fact that he was short in stature. Right? We're given that descriptor because it gives us a reason as to why Zacchaeus had to climb a tree. But there are two more descriptors. We see that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. And we also see that he was rich. And those two descriptors, if you were living in that day, told you everything that you needed to know about Zacchaeus, right? So let me kind of catch you up to speed in terms of the context here. Now, the city of Jericho, as well as the surrounding region, was completely under the rule and control of the Roman Empire at the time. And as you may know, the Roman Empire was so vast that there are few things that the empire could handle centralized. Right? And tax collecting was one of those things that could not be centralized into one place. It had to be outsourced out to the various regions. So each region took care of their own taxes that would then go to the empire. Now here's the thing. And here's how tax collectors were recruited and hired. They were hired among the people that were living in that given region. Okay? And what they would do is they would collect taxes from the folks. But here's the thing. These tax collectors would make their living by collecting more taxes than was required by law. And so they would take some of the money for themselves and would give the allotted amount back to the empire. And the Roman Empire kind of knew that. The centralized government knew that. And they were fine with it as long as they got the taxes that were due to them. And so what happened over time was that the system of tax collecting got more and more sophisticated so that there were hierarchies. So you would have a chief tax collector that was responsible for the entire region, and you would hire these under tax collectors, underlings, right? Tax collectors, right? And he would outsource the grunt work of collecting the taxes in these given specific regions out to these tax collectors, and they would take some money for themselves, give the rest up to the chief tax collector, and he would take a cut for himself and would give the rest, and on and so forth. And what we find here is that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector for the entire region. So you had other tax collectors that were working for him. And so he was kind of the head of the totem pole, if you will, of the entire region when it came to the extortion of the everyday people in that area. Okay? And so we come to this passage and we now understand that as chief tax collector, everybody knew about him. And here's what this also meant. As Zacchaeus' wealth grew, right? With every luxury item that he acquired that people were able to see, with every expansion of what would have been his enormous home that the people were privy to, they knew that with every penny that Zacchaeus made, it was off the backs of the poor and the struggling in the entire region. And so I hope that gives you a picture. As we get to today's passage, it's safe to say that Zacchaeus was probably the most hated man in the city of Jericho and possibly in the entire region. And Jesus looks at this man and he says, I must stay at your house today. What is going on here? Now, here the word must carries a ton of weight, especially in the book of Luke. And the word must is a word that is used throughout the book to highlight the nature of what Jesus came to do. So Jesus uses this very word must to describe him going to Jerusalem. He says, I must go to Jerusalem. He says, I must there suffer. He says, I must go to the cross to die. And Jesus says, I must go to your house today. Here, Jesus is putting a spotlight on his stay with Zacchaeus to communicate not just to Zacchaeus, not just to the crowd, but to us, something that is crucial about who he is and what he has come into the world to do. And that is that Jesus Christ came to seek and to save the lost. That he is drawn to the despised, to the hated, and to the sinners of all stripes. What's interesting is we read Luke 19, verse 1 to 10. But if you just look at the tail end of chapter 18, verse 35 to 43, what you see is an account of a blind beggar who didn't have a penny to his name calling out to Jesus. And Jesus goes to him to heal him. Isn't that such a wonderful picture? Whether it's a blind beggar or a chief tax collector, the world sees two people who could not be more different. But what Jesus sees are two people that are lost and two people that are tugging at his heart. Both lost and both in need and both drawing Jesus to them. Now, here's what this means for you and me. Here's how I want to put it. Most of us spend our entire lives, I'm just going to be honest here with all of us, most of us spend our entire lives managing the gap between where we are and where we want others to see us to be. In other words, we spend our entire life managing our image, how we come across to other people. And maybe we've gotten so good at it, we're managing our image to ourselves even, what we see when we look in the mirror. We spend our entire life managing this gap between who we are and who we present ourselves to be. And for many of us, those of us that are religious, religion just happens to be the most effective and primary tool of management, image management. That means, for the most religious among us, it may be true, let me put it this way, you can be deeply religious and be deeply hidden, both at the same time. And in fact, for many of us, we use religion to build a monument over our brokenness so that it's covered over. You may be thinking debaucherous things. You may be leading a very sinful life. But church attendance and church participation, the things that we say and we post on social media, covers it up. All the while it festers on the inside. The problem is when you do that, you're standing on shaky ground. Whether in this life or the next, it will be exposed. There's a famous pastor who a couple of years ago had a catastrophic scandal. that forced him out of ministry, and it caught even national attention. He gave a candid interview where he said this: "Even before I had something that was hidden and buried that I built on top of," which is the best way I can describe some of the habits I had. It was like, I'm going to fix this. This is done. I'll get around to this. Buried. And as we know, nothing ever gets buried. When you put something in secret, it expands. That's our life. We spend our entire life burying our brokenness, whether it's the trauma that we carry from our parents, all of us have some, whether it's a hurt that we have experienced in the past, or some shameful secret that if others saw it would be scandalized by, or harboring little thoughts of disdain towards people, whatever the case may be, or a lifestyle or a destructive habit that you're kind of nurturing within the confines of your bedroom or your home. We all carry those things, and we're just trying to manage our image on the outside, like how we look to others and even to ourselves as we look in the mirror. I know for so many of us, we sought after success for so much of our life because we were driven by those things, driven by our need to manage this gap so that we appear put together to other people. Jesus comes and drops a hammer on it. Saying, I did not come for the put together. I did not come for those with a spotless record. I did not come for those who are perfect, who appear to be perfect, because he would say, none of you are. I came to seek and to save the lost. Friend, are you scandalized by this? When you work through the scandal of Jesus, you will find, however, if you can work through that scandal, that you don't have to bury your brokenness. You don't have to cover it over. You don't have to try so hard to be somebody that you're not. You can, for many of us, you can finally be honest to yourself and others. You know, it took me 30 years and an intense season of counseling and therapy for me to begin to be honest to myself and others. I had brokenness buried so deep, I didn't even know it was there. Friends, so many of us live this way because we are afraid that if our brokenness came out to ourselves and others, we would be scandalized by it. Friend, Jesus says, I did not come for the qualified. I came for the failure. I did not come for those who are found. I came for the lost. Would you work through this scandal? That is the only way to respond to Jesus in a way that will lead to anything in your life being different. That's the second point. But finally, you need to invite him in. You need to invite him in. You need to let him in. Now, before we get into what Jesus does with Zacchaeus, I want us to take a look at the crowd. Right? The crowd, they are grumbling, and understandably so. What do they say? He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Now, let me tell you, for those, maybe you're around my age, 40s, 50s, whatever, elder millennials or Gen X or above, it doesn't really resonate with us, and we say, those judgmental people, God is merciful, why are they bothering him? But here's what younger people understand, and I'll get into in a moment. What we need to understand is that when they're grumbling, they're not just kind of moral highbrowing and judging somebody in a way that, we should be frowning on. It's actually a cry for justice. I just explained to you the context. They would have been asking the question, like, how is that man who got rich off the backs of the poor, kowtowing to the Roman Empire, right, who is part and parcel with the oppressive nature of this evil empire? How is that man getting off scot-free? How is that man being approached by Jesus? Is this the man that we're supposed to follow? They must have been asking. We thought Jesus was for the poor. We thought that Jesus was for the oppressed. I thought Jesus was going to dismantle this oppressive empire so that we experience freedom for our people at last. That's what they were hoping for. And they must have been asking, wow, maybe Jesus is exactly like every other political figure we've ever seen throughout human history, where they say they are for the poor and the weak. Maybe he's just after his own interest after all. Here he is cozying up to this man Zacchaeus. Do you see why the crowds are grumbling? See, the younger generation get this. You know, when I was a college pastor, this was like 16 years ago, one of the most common questions that I got from college students was this: why do bad things happen to good people? Turns out, I did some digging, that the younger generation don't feel this way at all. They have a different issue. And there was a magazine article where a Bible professor at a Christian college was interviewed, and he would talk about this example of David and Bathsheba, this famous incident in which David commits adultery with Bathsheba and has her husband killed. And here's what this professor says. He says, "My students struggled not with the account of David's sins against Bathsheba and her husband, but with the aftermath. They were deeply concerned that David was let off too easily. The difficulty for them was not David's sin, which they found unsurprising, right? Seeing their leaders sin. But the difficulty, he says, was God's forgiveness and mercy." Here we come to a conundrum, huh? Like, how can Zacchaeus get off scot-free? Yes, we get that God is gracious and merciful. That is great. But how can Zacchaeus just get off scot-free? Where is the justice? And friends, here's the irony. Here's the beauty of the gospel, is that it cuts both ways. The irony is that Jesus answers their cries for justice, just not in the way they expected it. See, we see Zacchaeus come out of the house. We don't know what happened in that house. Man, I would love to know. But Zacchaeus walks out of the house, and what does he say? "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." Any way that you try to calculate what this would have cost him leads to his financial ruin. He voluntarily gives up all of his wealth to make right what he had done wrong. The crowd wanted justice. They got it. It's just that it came in a way that they didn't expect. See, the crowd wanted justice through condemnation. Jesus brought justice through grace. And friends, that's the mystery of grace. I hear people say, "Why are you talking about the grace of God all the time? You need to follow the law of God." Grace leads to you following a law in ways that condemnation never could. That is the beauty and the mystery of the gospel. Here's how one author by the name of Anne Lamott put it. She said, "I do not at all understand the mystery of grace, only that it meet us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us." That's why the scriptures say it is the kindness of God that leads you to repentance. Put it another way, the surest sign that somebody understood the grace of God is a radically transformed life. Now here's a question. What happened to Zacchaeus? And for some of us, might be the reason why we've only dipped our toes into Christianity, because you've seen people do crazy things in the name of God, giving their lives up to be a missionary somewhere, or God forbid, be a pastor. Right? What happened to Zacchaeus, who went from somebody who learned to ignore the condemning eyes of the crowd for his own gain, to somebody who willingly comes out and says, I will go into financial ruin to keep the law of God? What happened? Let me tell you what happened. He met Jesus. Jesus Christ comes into Jericho, sees Zacchaeus in a tree, and Jesus knows exactly who Zacchaeus is. He knows the crowd. He knows what the crowd will say about him. And he doesn't care. Jesus Christ absorbs the grumbling indignation so that Zacchaeus may be welcomed. See, this is what Jesus did for Zacchaeus, and let me tell you what Jesus does for you. Jesus Christ absorbed the indignation of the crowd as he carried the cross, the mocking and the jeering and the whipping. He endured the humiliation of the cross, the nails, the nakedness. Jesus Christ bore the crowd so that you and I don't have to. And you know what that does? That tells you that your worth isn't something that needs to be protected. It tells you that you aren't accepted because of your wealth. You aren't accepted because of your morality. You aren't accepted, in other words, because you are acceptable. It tells you that you are accepted because you are a beloved child of God. And when you understand that all of those things that used to be all important to you now go out to the periphery of your identity, and you are able to let it go, because what has happened? You invited Jesus in, and he took center stage in your heart. And you say, everything else can go. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And obeying his law is everything to me. Not because I have to, but because I get to. Because it glorifies this God who gave everything to me. Friends, here's what a genuine, saving encounter with Jesus looks like. And here's what will actually change your life. Get close. Work through the scandal. And invite him in. Because that grace will change your life. Where you say, no matter the cost, all I need is Jesus. The only one I need to depend on is Jesus. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Will you welcome his pursuit? Would you respond in kind to him? And friends, may we be a church that as we follow after Jesus takes on his priorities, may we, like Jesus, have our hearts be drawn to the last, the least, and the lost, and to pursue after them in love. May we join this pursuit of God as he pursued after us. Let's pray.